Hello everyone. So welcome back. This is Health Economics. So in chapter 14, we are going to continue to discuss about the supply side of the healthcare system. So mainly in this chapter, we are going to talk about the health technology assessments. Well, as we discussed in the previous chapters, we have found several problems that we face. Well, first of all, the supply of healthcare is very limited. Well, for various reasons, we have very tough trainings to go through for physicians. We also talked about the pharmaceutical industry. It's been very fragile to the competitions in the market, so that the government will have to provide them some guarantee income by giving them the monopoly powers. Well, now we are going to actually go into the topics of, well, with this new technologies and new way of treating disease in the market, well, what types of technology we should adopt? So what kind of services should we actually cover from the uh, social planner's perspective, or maybe from a private insurance perspective? There are several things that we have to learn in this chapter. Especially, we are going to pick up two types of analysis to evaluate the effectiveness of new technologies. So the situation given here is, well, if one day you become one of the committee members voting on medical or Medicare policy in the US, so there are several ways to treat lung cancer in the market. So let's suppose, and the price of these treatments varies, depends on how complicated it is or how much capital inputs will have to contribute to those treatments. Let's suppose we have three different types of treatment: treatment A, B, and C. And the cost for the treatments is the following: $50,000 per year for treatment A, $10,000 per year for treatment B, and C, $3,000 per year. So in this case, well, what treatments or which kind of treatments worth the insurance company or maybe for the Medicare departments to cover for the cost? So obviously, if we are going to cover everything in this economy, people will always choose the most expensive one because of moral hazards. Well, people will always pick the ones that it's most expensive and maybe give them very marginal benefits in treating the um, health conditions. So as a government agents, of course, we cannot actually approve the coverage on any treatments in the market because some of those treatments may be insanely expensive, like treatment A, but it does not justify with its benefits to the patients. Maybe the benefits we see from treatment A and treatment B are just marginally better for treatment A. So how would you think about this if you are covered by the Medicare and have a lung cancer? So on the reverse, what if you are not one of the committee members voting on this policy, but instead you are covered by Medicare and now you have a lung disease or lung cancers? And that perspective will totally change the way which policies should be covered. Because at the end of the day, well, policy it's voting by people. If those populations actually they insist to cover all the treatments, well, at the end of the day, the policy may actually get passed through the legislations. So in order to evaluate what type of treatments worth to cover, well, we are going to introduce a method called the Health Technology Assessment, HTA, which is commonly used nowadays by both the private insurers and the public insurers. Well, under the Health Technology Assessment, there are two parts of this assessment we are going to learn in this chapter. So number one is the cost effectiveness analysis. So this analysis is basically providing a science of comparing the costs and benefits of different medical treatments. And the second part of it is the cost benefits analysis. Well, in this analysis, we are going to learn a process for choosing the optimal treatments by creating a trade-off between money and health. So in general, the cost effectiveness analysis will lay out all the costs and benefits for different treatments so that we can compare them. And the cost benefits analysis will providing us a tool to select one of the treatments in the market that will optimize our utility. So the HTA might actually sound a little bit dry because basically it's an evaluation, it's a comparison different treatments. However, technically it becomes a very, very, very controversial tool to use. And specifically, actually it involves the values of human lives. So that makes it a very difficult techniques to adopt by the government because, well, when we talk about the values of human life, it becomes very, very sensitive to the politicians. There's no way that we can actually value life, and specifically to someone that you don't know. You cannot actually say, well, the life of your father, it's actually greater than the life of some homeless people sleeping on the streets. So it becomes very complicated, and that's the reason why even the departments of health in the United States, mainly deciding the Medicare policy, they are not allowed to actually apply the health technology assessment to make the decisions within those committees. However, for the private insurers, it makes sense for them to actually evaluate, to actually approve on certain treatments to be covered in the insurance contract. So first, we are going to take a look at the cost effectiveness analysis, and then we will go over the cost benefit analysis after defining those comparisons. So the definitions for cost effectiveness analysis, basically it's a process of measuring the cost and health benefits of different kinds of medical treatments, procedures, and therapies. So the cost effectiveness analysis, it's shortened by CEA. Basically, it's a less controversial part of the HTA because it's concerned with only measuring the cost and benefit. It does not involve with the values of life. So often, multiple treatments or various costs can be used to treat a given disease. So you can actually think about there might be some disease to treat, like flu. So season flu, there might be several different ways for the doctor to prescribe different treatments, or maybe sometimes the doctor may just tell you to drink more water and take a rest at home until you fight off those sickness. So in such case, well, how insurance company decide which treatment, or if any, to provide the coverage for? Right? So there are so many different ways to treat the same thing. Well, should the insurance company always cover the most expensive one and also the least expensive one? Or is there a way for the insurance company to decide, well, certain treatment is more cost effective so that they will actually cover, and comparing to those that it's not so effective with the cost? And how do patients actually decide between an expensive and highly effective treatment and a low-cost treatment that is less effective? Those are the questions we are going to justify in this sections. So think about this simple case here. Let's suppose if there is one treatment for both cheaper and more effective than the second treatments, then we say the second treatment is said to be dominated by the first one. So let's suppose we have this weird disease happens in the world, and finally we came down to only two treatments for this weird disease. And treatment A costs about $20,000 in total, and it will extend the patient life by 2 years from this disease. On the other hand, another company come up with a second treatment or a different treatment, which is treatment B. It costs about $40,000 in total, but this treatment can only extend the patient life by 1 year. So in this case, treatment B, it's both more expensive and less benefits to the patients. So given the fact that treatment B, it's more expensive and given less benefits to the patients, we said that the treatment B, it's being dominated by treatment A. And we also call this a dominated treatment. So if either treatment is being dominant, one treatment must be both more expensive and more effective. So that means if given, let's say, several different treatments available in the markets, some treatments are more expensive, but then they're more effective comparing to the other treatments. And also there are some treatments that it's least expensive, however, they are also least effective to treat the health conditions. Well, we said there is no dominant treatments in the market. Well, in this case, it makes the decision rule a little bit more complicated, because in the previous case, obviously, no one will ever choose the dominated treatment because it's both more expensive and also at the same time less effective. So in this case, we have to make use of the cost effectiveness analysis to decide whether people should choose one extra level of treatments that cost a higher values in terms of monetary. So to begin with this analysis here, so we consider in a simple case, there are basically two treatments, treatment A and treatment B, to cure the same disease. So A is both more expensive and more effective than B. So either treatment dominates the other. So in this case, we have to make use of one particular technical tools to compare the two treatments. So this tool, it's what we call the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, and sometimes we shorten it as ICER. So how are we going to calculate these ratios? So let's suppose the treatment A, it's both more expensive and more effective than B. Well, then we are going to calculate the ratio by using this following formula here. So let's define what is CA, CB, EA, and EB here. So the incremental cost effectiveness ratio is calculated by using CA, which is the cost for treatment A, minus the cost of treatment B, divided by the benefits of treatment A minus the benefits of treatment B. And this ratio will always be greater than 0. So that means this ratio will always be positive. So let's give a very simple example to illustrate this formula here. So let's suppose there are two treatments for HIV. So treatment A costs about $30,000 in total, and after this treatment, the patient will gain 5.2 years of life, extended from the comparing to this person does not take any treatment. And on the other hand, treatment B will cost about $25,000. It's a less expensive one. However, the benefits for this treatment will also be less effective compared to A, because it will only extend life for this patient by 4.8 years. So here we are actually defining the benefits by the years of life extended from the treatment. there are many different factors we can define as benefit, especially when we are treating different illness, like the mental illness, or maybe a broken leg, or maybe other types of severe pains. Those benefits can be defined by different units. But here, just to make things a little bit simpler, because we can actually easily define what we mean by years of life extended. So let's suppose we are going to identify the ICER for treatment A and treatment B. We are going to use the formula or apply the formula here to calculate the ratios. So we are using $30,000 minus the cost of treatment B, $25,000, divided by the benefits of treatment A, 5.2 years extensions of life, minus the benefits for treatment B, 4.8 years extension of life. And finally, we came down to the conclusions that the ratio of these two treatments is $12,500 per year. Or you can actually simplify this number to divide this number by 365, and then you will get $34.25 per day. So let's interpret this result here. What does this number actually mean? Well, this number actually means by taking treatment A over treatment B, well, the patients will actually have to pay additional $12,500 per year in order to extend his life by 1 year. Or you can actually simplify to say, because we have the number per day, you can actually also say, well, it costs the patient $34.25 to extend 1 day of life by taking treatment A comparing to treatment B. So this ratio actually makes a very, very important interpretations in the case of evaluations of which treatment should be covered. Because now the fact is, if someone actually value the life at a different rate, well, the treatments that worth to cover becomes a very different results. So let's suppose the ICER is providing a price for life extension from different treatments. Well, in this same sense, in some sense, basically people can extend the life for average of $34.25 per day. Well, this ratio here does not actually make a determinations about whether it's worth it or not to get the treatments. However, it providing us a very clear cost, whether the people who taking or choosing between the two treatments, it worth to get the more expensive one. So in this case, if the patients who have HIV, he or she is willing to pay an additional $34.25 to live 1 more day longer, well, this person will always choose treatment A over treatment B. However, if that person's it's stepping into the end of his life and he think that, you know what, I don't really enjoy being living longer because I have this HIV, all I get is extensions of suffering and pains, well, then this person may not think that it's worth them or worth him or her $34.25 per day of life. Well, this person will ultimately choose to go through treatment B, and the money that this person saved might actually use to spend on something else that gain more utility in his life or her life. So this is a very, very useful tool to apply to actually evaluate the values of those treatments or the true cost of the treatments comparing to other in the markets. And let's suppose if we are going to assume a simple case that a patient choosing to receive any treatments comparing to if she or he does not receive any treatments, and this person will die immediately from the illness. Well, then we can actually rewrite this ICER comparing the treatment results and also the non-treatment results. So in this formula here, CT basically is the cost of the treatments, and CN is the cost for not taking the treatments, which is usually 0. And ET is the benefits for taking the treatments minus the benefits for not taking the treatments. And obviously, in this case, the benefits for not taking the treatments will become 0 again, because the fact that that person is assumed to be dead if this person is not going to receive any treatments. So this special case, if we believe is true, well, then the ICER between treatment and non-treatment will become CT divided by ET, because, well, CT minus 0 is CT. ET minus 0 is ET itself. Well, this, we have a special name for it. Well, in this case, we call this a average cost effectiveness ratio, the ACER. This is one particular treatment or the average cost for one particular treatment in the market. When we assume, again, the person does not have any additional cost for not taking the treatment and does not live any longer than at the time when he or she making a decisions to receive treatments or not. Well, the average cost effectiveness ratio, it's very tempting for economists or maybe regular people to use in order to compare with other treatments, because, well, this is definitely a much easier number to get. Imagine if we have 10 different treatments for the same disease in the market. Well, we have to cross comparing different treatments with the ICER equations with many different equations or many different results. We have to compare treatment A to treatment B, treatment A to treatment C, treatment A to treatment D. Well, you kind of get the idea. There are so many different combinations of comparison we have to come up with in order to justify our results. So in this case, we are going to take a look, is it okay, or does it actually make sense to compare the average cost effectiveness ratio? So if we are going to compare the average cost effective ratios of different treatments in the market, well, of course, the problem is, first, it has to be true that the person who are not taking the treatment will die immediately, well, which is generally not true. And also, secondly, we also assume there is no additional cost for the person who has the disease and not to have any additional cost in life, which again is not true, because when people actually suffer from the sickness, well, this person may actually have difficulty moving around, or maybe receiving some pain, or maybe having difficulty to actually go from one location to another locations, or maybe this person has to visit his doctor more frequently. So there should be some additional costs that generate from having a disease in life. Or maybe the most trivial cost is not being able to work. The income loss also, it's a financial loss. So in this case, the assumption does not actually justify itself. But what's more important is, if we are going to compare the average cost effectiveness ratios with different drugs or different treatments in the markets, it actually might misleading people to believe the lowest average cost effectiveness ratios might provide a better or cheaper options to the patient. Is it the case? Oh, of course. I would say it's not, because the fact is we cannot just compare the average, and also because of the two assumptions that we made before, it does not make sense to have comparisons between the average cost effectiveness ratios. Well, since comparing different treatments in the markets becomes so complicated when there are more than 2 or 3 options, well, we have to come up with a different tool. And the tool we use in general, it's what we call the cost effectiveness frontier. So the cost effectiveness frontier, the CEF, is defined as a subset of treatment strategies for a condition that are not dominated by any other treatments. So any treatments on the CEF is set to be potentially cost effective. So the CEF basically simplifies the comparison process between treatments by allowing analysis to rule out the dominated drugs, which should never be used, and focus only on the options that are potentially cost effective. Now, well, we have this frontier that we would like to define, and how are we going to find out this frontier? Well, it's actually quite simple. It's much more simpler than we first of original thought. It actually involves very, very minimal math. Indeed, whenever we are drawing a frontier, it's usually related to the graph. So let's suppose we have 7 different treatments that we have available for one particular disease called hepatitis. Consider the options between A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So there are many different treatments for this one disease. And they both actually involve with different causes and different outcomes. In this case, let's say the benefit is the extensions of year live from this disease. So let's suppose treatment A, treatment B, with the comparisons, it costs almost the same amount of dollar, but treatment B actually extend longer life comparing to treatment A. So obviously, in this case, treatment B is much better treatments comparing to A. And we said treatment A, it's being dominated by treatment B. But when we comparing treatment A to treatment G, well, it becomes complicated because, well, obviously, treatment A is much cheaper than treatment G, but treatment G actually providing much higher level of life extensions. So by drawing a frontier, we can actually easily illustrate which treatment is the most cost effective in the markets. So the way we are going to do it is to connect all the non-dominated options to form this cost effectiveness frontier, CEF. We are always going to start with the original point where people spending 0 amounts of dollar, and they will start with 0 gain of years. But the next point that we want to get to, maybe it's some point that's outside of the origins of this graph. So let's suppose we're thinking about connecting the origins with point C, which is treatment C. By spending some amount of money, we can actually get extensions of life by a little. However, is it a cost-effective treatment or options in the markets? Well, I would say probably not. But why not? Because the fact is there is a treatment that is cheaper and also more effective, which is treatment D. So let's take a look of this comparison between treatment C and D. Obviously, D is better options, and C will definitely be dominated by option D. So the frontier actually starts from the origins to the first point, which is treatment D. Well, we are not going to go back to point C because obviously by paying more money and we will only get less, so we'll bypass point C. So going from point D, we have another two options that possibly be better treatments, which is point A and point D. And again, we never actually pay more money to get less benefits. So point A doesn't seem to be a good choice. So connecting point D to point A, obviously it's not a correct way to draw this frontier. So the next point we are going to connect from treatment D is treatment B. So comparing treatment D and treatment B, well, treatment D is less expensive, but has less effectiveness to gain. But treatment B, on the other hand, it's more effective, but people have to pay higher price. Again, when we look at the next options here, we have to compare point F and point G. So going from point B, well, which point we should actually get to? Well, obvious choice is point G because, well, again, point F will have the patient to pay much higher price comparing to point treatment B, but people will only get less benefits. So the next point to connect from point B is point G. Now the question is, should we ever actually connect point G to point E? Well, if we are going to connect these 2 points here, obviously this is a very, very stupid choice because people, again, can actually pay less for treatment G comparing to treatment E and get a higher level of extensions of life, so higher benefits from treatment G to treatment E. So in this case, well, the cost effectiveness frontier actually ends at point G. So what does this frontier actually explain to us? Well, this cost effectiveness frontier actually gives us a very, very important information because, well, this frontier explains to us which treatments in the markets are the most cost effective. So in this case, well, treatment A, treatment C, treatment F, and treatment E should never be considered in the market because, well, they are both more expensive and at the same time least effective comparing to all the other treatments on the frontier, which is point D, point B, and point G. So drawing these cost effectiveness frontier, it's not very complicated because obviously once we plot all these options on a graph, we can immediately see, well, we are going to only connect the points on the left hand, or the most left hand side in the graph with the highest points. Anything that's within the frontier will not be considered because they are not cost effective. Well, the slope of the treatments will also be very important to interpret. So let's suppose we are going to consider to think about the slope of these 3 points here, point A, point C, point H. Well, these loops actually give us the reverse of the ICER between the two treatments. So for example, if we are trying to find out the ICER between treatment A and treatment C in this diagram here, we are basically calculating the slope of these 2 points and then inverse it. Same for the ICER between treatment H and treatment C. We are also again calculating the slope of these 2 points, and then we inverse it, and it becomes the ICER between the 2 treatments. So this cost effectiveness frontier actually gives us not only the benefits to pick out the most cost-effective treatments in the market, but at the same time, it gives us the information about the cost-effective ratios between different treatments. So now let's think about measuring the costs, right? So if we have this one way, the incremental cost-effective ratios that tell us which treatments will worth how much more comparing to the other. Well, now it's a good point to think about, well, how are we supposed to measure those costs of treatments? So in order to calculate the ICER, of course, we have to measure the cost of each treatment correctly. So whether the treatment is found to be cost-effective depends upon the prospective tickets. Well, because the treatment costs and benefits differ for each party. Well, think about as a social planner perspective, well, all the costs should be counted, such as if you are running a government program, let's suppose just like the beginning of the chapter, I was giving you the situation, you'll be a committee to vote on those Medicare programs, and you will be able to affect or change those policy. Well, which treatments should be covered? Well, now you should, as a social planner, you should consider the cost as in a general social cost instead of just the cost for the treatment. Because you should also consider, well, taking those treatments, well, the patient will also have to travel to certain places, and also there are some preparations may have to be done before the treatments it's being implemented. There might be some social cost of this person taking the treatments may losing the ability to work, so the social costs include again the loss of income for this person. So this is basically a different perspective of how social planner actually view the cost of treatments. On the other hand, as a patient perspective, well, the cost basically depends on how much the patient has to pay out of pockets. So in a patient perspective, if you have a disease, you want to find this one treatment that it's cost effective, you only care about the cost that you have to pay. So it depends on who you are. Well, who makes the final decisions, who will influence the policy? Well, different perspective will actually affect how the cost it's being measured in the calculations of incremental cost effectiveness ratios. Well, not only how we supposed to measure the cost in terms of what perspective, but which cost should also count in the calculations become very complicated or controversial. Let's suppose a complete cost of new lung cancer treatments costs about $1,000. So is this the only cost to consider? So what if the treatments must be administered in distant locations for extended period of time? So what about if the treatment is uncomfortable and has some unwarranted side effects? And what if the treatments will lead to adverse health effects in the future? So those are the questions to rise, and those are the costs that the social planner will consider. And so also which cost should count depends on well, how should the future cost to be counted. So think about if the lung cancer patients are cured, but then it goes on to have a costly heart attack, and those heart attacks actually cost another additional medical expenditures or health expenditures to the public health system. So those costs, again, as a social perspective or social planner perspective, well, those future costs should count towards to the total cost of the treatments. Well, there have been so many debates, so controversial debates on how those future costs should be included in the cost of treatments or measuring the cost of treatments. But in general, we do have some compromise number that some economists agree upon on. Well, also, since we are not only depending on the cost of the treatments, we also need the effectiveness or benefits for the treatments to come up with the ratios. So calculating the effectiveness or maybe measuring the effectiveness becomes one of the most challenging jobs to do. So one common measures of effectiveness is increased life expectancy, which is what we have been discussed. But how are we going to count other health benefits that affect quality of life, such as increased mobility if we are going to provide a surgery that can cure a broken leg, freedom from pains? How about we have treatments to treat, let's say, lung cancer without so much of a pains? Well, how those effectiveness should be counted towards to the equations? Well, in order to actually get to that measure, we have to come up with another set of numbers or maybe units or uniform measurements to calculate the effectiveness of treatments. And this measurement is what we call the quality adjusted life year. So QALY is shortened for this term. So the quality adjusted life years basically is an approach to combine the quality of life and the life expectancy into one single index number. So in this calculations, well, each year of life, they receive a quality weight of Q. So it's a weight of quality between 0 to 1 that reflects the quality of that life year. So for example, for 1 year of life, for a perfect health persons, well, the quality of weight Q should equals to 1. So it's a complete life. This person lived very happily with his health status. So his score of 1. On the other hand, if someone living that 1 year of life that suffer a chronic cough or maybe a insomnia, well, this kind of uncomfort disease may actually reduce the level of quality of that one person. So in this case, the Q, the weight of quality will reduce from 1 to 0.5. So that means that person living that 1 year of life with this symptom will have a quality of 0.5 instead of 1 as a perfect health person. Also, you can also imagine someone who confined to a wheelchair for that 1 year of life. So someone with a broken leg cannot move anywhere. He has to sit in the wheelchair for 1 whole year. Well, the quality of life will definitely be reduced significantly from a perfect health perspective. But in this case, well, we simply assume, well, people who has to sit in the wheelchair, cannot move around, losing those mobility, will have a quality of life 0.25. So the more serious of the sickness, we assume here in this simple example, will have a much lower quality of life with that 1 year living. But again, the problem is, well, who has the rights to make those judgments? And we will return to these questions in the later sections. So for now, we just assume, well, there are some quantifiable quality weights that we can actually define. But again, why these measurements might not spit out the truth for various reasons, which we are going to discuss in just a few minutes. So let's suppose in the mathematical form, we say the quality of life can be measured by QALY, and it requires at least 3 pieces of information. So number 1 is the probability of surviving of each year time t. And number 2, the quality of life QT for each year living. And number 3, the time discounted rates, usually between 3 to 5%, according to most of the study in the our studies of discount rates of life. So the total quality of life from that life expectancies, it's basically defined as the quality adjusted life expectancy, the QALE. So instead of talking about each year, what is the quality of life, might give us the utility. Well, we can also define the total life expectancies with the given quality. So this measurements, QALE, it's the number of additional years that person expect to live and weighted with the discounted quality of life in each of those years. So basically it's the sum of all the QALY, so every single year is lived. Well, we are not going to go through those technical measurements of quality of life. We are going to actually focus on, well, what makes this life expectancies quality weights not a very, very accurate measure. So in order to get the quality weight, well, there are several ways to do it. But one very common way to do it is to send out survey to people and ask them, well, how happy or how healthy they think they are. So this one very simple way to do it is by visual analogical scales, the VAS. So this VAS, just like the picture you see, it has a scale from 0 to 1. So 0 is the worst and 100 is the best health status. So basically we can send out survey to the patients and ask them, well, how healthy do you think you are? The pros of this strategies or surveys is simple because it's very easy to read. It's simple for the administrator to record, and it's easy for the respondent to understand. However, there are some economists, they are not very happy about this surveys because it does not require the respondent to think about the trade-off between different health status. So the result actually may not reflect the intensity of the respondent's preference. So in order to provide these trade-off options, well, there are other types of surveys also available for asking the same questions. The second common types of survey that usually economists will use is what we call the standard gamble. So the standard gamble basically it's a survey for health conditions. Each respondent will have to choose between being healthy with certainties or to gamble with a probability of P and with the full health and the probability of 1 minus P to death. So basically the patients will have to choose, well, do I whether to be fully healthy with some amount of probability and with 1 minus those probability to being death, or maybe I would just stay as where I am right now to be sick with the certainty outcomes. So this analysis or this kind of survey actually providing the patients a choice to choose whether to be in a certain state, to be not so healthy, but or maybe the probability to get full health, right, living a full health living conditions, but with some probability to die. So this trade-off, it's actually very important because this actually giving the patients a way to think about, well, whether they are in a good shape now or in a bad shape, and choosing between how much they would like to or how likely they will actually choose to be in situations to gamble with the health. So the pros of this types of survey is it reflects the intensities of preference better than the VAS. However, the cons in this approach, it might actually affect or maybe influenced by the level of risk aversions of the patients. So people with higher level of risk aversions, they may actually choose the certain outcome to suffer with a lower level of health. Not suffer, but choosing to be in the lower level of health. And also people with least risk aversions, well, they are more likely to gamble. They don't mind to take those high risks. Well, they will respond the survey with the choice of probability to gamble on health, full health and death. So the people often respond in the counterintuitive ways to such as uncertain gambles because of the risk aversions attitudes of the persons. Well, the third types of surveys that are available in the market in our most of the analysis in the world, it's what we call the time trade-off. So in this case, well, it's pretty similar to the gamble strategies, but in such the time trade-off surveys, well, respondents basically choosing either to live for 10 T years, so many years, with a health status H before dying, or option 2, living for a shorter amount of time in a full health before dying. So the quality weights Q of the status H is the ratios of the shorter times divided by the longer times to be in the health states, which is less than the full health state. So the pros of this, again, it reflects the intensity of the preference, but the cons in this case is the bias if the time that the person choose to live shorter with the full health, it's a function of age. So that means when people actually living in the older age, they usually tend to choose a shorter amounts of time to live because they know it ultimately they will have to die. And the closer they are to that age to die, well, they will choose to have full health instead of being poor health and live a little bit longer. So there are some biases also reflected in this survey. So in general, the surveys can be very useful to identify the quality of life from the respondents, but again, well, it really depends on who should we actually survey, right? So such as if we are going to send out those surveys to healthy respondents, well, because those people, they never get into those very critical conditions, they can never imagine how difficult it is to go through those treatments or maybe go through those illness. So in this case, they may actually underestimate the quality of life in the sick state. On the other hand, some people might suggest, well, instead of asking the healthy respondents, we can actually send those surveys to experts, such as doctors and physicians. Well, those expert panels, they might be able to actually tell how difficult it is to go through those illnesses. But again, sometimes the experts, they might be actually overestimating, or maybe sometimes they are being secure to respond to those surveys. And again, it provides a biased preference for the patients or respondents to those surveys. Well, the last conditions, of course, well, we can actually directly send surveys to the patients and ask them, well, how do they think about the quality of life within those years of being sick? However, there's also one factor that affecting the or maybe giving a bias of this surveys. People who tend to live with the conditions for a long time, well, somehow they will get adapted to those hard feelings or maybe a very painful life or painful conditions with the sickness. And people who adapt to those hardships, usually they will understating those quality suffering with the sickness. So that means people who have, let's say, a cancer for several years already, they already adapt to those pain to go through those treatments. So when they actually receive the survey, they may actually say, well, you know what, it's not that difficult because we have been receiving these treatments or maybe being suffer with the disease for so long. So those respondents might actually underestimate or understate the the negative effects on quality of life from those sickness. So again, well, these are the biases that we cannot avoid. So we cannot actually have a one complete perfect survey or measures of quality of life, and it's still a challenge that we have to face. Well, talking so much about the cost effectiveness analysis, well, now we are going to shift our focus on the next analysis, which is the cost benefit analysis. So the cost benefit analysis, again, is a method for us to choose the optimal treatments for someone. So the definitions of cost benefit analysis, the CBA, is that it is a process of choosing an optimal treatment amount, all potentially cost-effective ones, given a certain monetary values for each unit of health effects. So not only we are going to define the costs and benefits of the treatment, but now we are going to put in some values, monetary values, and to see whether the treatment's worth that person to pay for those treatments, or maybe worth for someone to choose a specific treatments in the markets. So this optimal treatment is then termed as cost effective for the person or the agents with the variations. So let's suppose when we place a monetary values on each quality of life, we implicitly creating basically a set of indifference curve that can be plotted with the CEF. So for example, well, let us assume a person value each quality year at $100,000. So that means this person actually think to have improvements on one quality year worth to spend $100,000. So as a result, his indifference curve sloped such that his indifference between one additional year gain of quality life is $100,000. So for one additional year gain in life, well, this person willing to pay $100,000 for it. So we are going to revisit the crucial questions of how to value life years accurately. So in this specific case, we're basically thinking about the cost-effective frontier and putting the indifference curve with it. So we still have the same cost-effective frontier, plotting three different treatments: treatment A, treatment C, and treatment H. And we have so many different indifference curve that illustrates the values of additional life with $100,000. So we have one indifference curve that we illustrate as IO, and also another indifference curve illustrate as I1. So in our economic analysis here, we basically imagine there are so many different indifference curve in this diagram. We're only plotting two of them, and each of them will have the same slope. So the procedure here is to first plot the indifference curve, and then find the tangency points that go through the cost-effective frontier. So in this case, obviously, when we actually finding the tangency point, that means, well, the indifference curve will only have one point touching the cost-effective frontier, and that will be point C. So the indifference curve IO actually is a tangency of point C. Well, that actually implies that the cost-effective treatments for this particular case, where the person value his life $100,000 per additional quality year, will always choose treatment C. So this is the most cost-effective treatment for this person. Well, this is not a coincidence. Actually, assuming this situations, we can actually kind of tell why this makes sense for the person to choose treatment C. Well, as you can see, or actually refresh to your previous slides, the slope of the cost-effective frontier actually represents the additional cost to pay for these treatments comparing to the previous one. So in this case, the ICER represents $60,000 per quality of life. This is basically the cost to get treatment C over treatment A. So people who valued more than $60,000 per quality year, well, they will always be willing to pay for treatment C over treatment A because they know they can get higher level of year lived. On the other hand, if people valued more than $500,000 per quality year, well, they will always get treatment H, even though it's a much more expensive treatment, since the person is willing to actually pay more than $500,000 to live one more quality year. Well, this person will always use or pick the most expensive treatments in the market. However, in our case, well, the person we observe is only willing to pay $100,000 for one additional year to live. So in this case, well, obviously, the treatments this person will choose will always be treatment C. So consider the same situations. Well, how does the insurance actually affect the person's decisions to choose which treatments to use? Let's suppose we assume there is an insurance package that covers 90% of the drug cost or the treatment cost. Regardless what it is, well, the insurance company will always cover any expenses, 90% of the cost. So the insurance coverage actually lower the patient's out-of-pocket price per quality of year. So in this case, well, obviously, when the insurance paying 90% of the price for any treatments, well, the patients will only have to pay 10% of the total cost. Well, in this case, for patients who wants to use drug C, now he only has to pay 10% of the total cost, which is $160,000. So for for the 3 quality of year, the persons will only has to pay, or the patients will only have to pay $16,000 for 3 years of extensions of life. On the other hand, well, 10% out of the total $360,000 will be $36,000. So by paying out of pocket $36,000 totals, well, this patient will get 3.4 years of extensions of life. Well, again, by looking at the diagram here, you can kind of see what happens to this patients here with the insurance cover 90% of the total insurance or healthcare costs. So you can still see the same diagram where the dotted lines with point A, point C, point H illustrate the original cost-effective frontier for the patients without insurance, and also another frontier that it's being drawn by the gray line with point A prime, C prime, and H prime illustrates the out-of-pocket cost for the patients who it's being covered by the insurance package. So in this case, well, since the out-of-pocket cost is so low, but that person can actually pay so much to get the treatments to extend the life, because these patients will actually value 1 year of life with $100,000, but this person will only have to pay $36,000 for the most expensive treatments in the market. So in this case, the patient will always choose the most expensive ones comparing to the cheaper one. Well, now I believe you can kind of link the problem that we studied before, right? People who are being covered with the insurance, well, somehow he will change his behavior comparing to if the person does not have any insurance. So obviously, moral hazards problem comes in. So the moral hazard problem actually being illustrated in the previous examples, it's related to the health technological assessment. The additional costs for these expensive drugs or treatments are being shared by everyone in the patient's insurance pool. So whoever who bought the insurance with the same company and not getting sick, well, those are the people not using the benefits of the insurance, but actually sharing the cost of this sick patients. So the insurance actually encourage technological overuse in the market. People who don't actually want to get the treatments before buying the insurance, now because their cost is being shared with the pool of people, so they are more likely to get the most expensive one. So they are overusing those technology comparing to with no insurance markets. And this, it's basically the development of inefficiency innovations. So given the problem of moral hazards, many insurance companies, they will use another strategy called rationing in order to limit such technological overuse in the market. So rationing basically defined as any methods used by the insurer or maybe public insurer even for allocating a scarce resources other than prices. So for example, the insurance company or national health insurance system, they might actually decline to pay for those treatments that it's not cost effective at all. So in the case of our cost-effective frontier, the insurance company might actually decline to cover the expensive treatments for drug H. As the insurance company, it's only willing to cover 90% of the expenses for drug A and drug C. Well, then the patient will most likely to choose as the original choice drug C, because well now the insurance company will not cover any costs for using drug H. Well, by doing that, obviously it gives us a better or more efficient choice as a society. People who used to choose the second most expensive drug, the most cost-effective drugs as per the values of life, well, now he will choose the same drugs, but he pay actually much less. For those drugs that it's too expensive to buy or to get, well, now insurance we denying to cover for those drugs, well, it becomes a efficient choice for both the patients and the insurance company, because now there will not be overuse of these new technologies or maybe more expensive technology, but the patient is getting the benefits. They have to pay less for choosing the same choice. So rationing is one of the strategies that actually apply to both the public insurance and also private insurance markets. Now, one very controversial topics to discuss is how we can actually value life. So someone, as we mentioned, who value life for one additional years of life to be $100,000, it will be very, very different comparing to other people who view the life. Estimating the value of life become very complicated. However, there are still some way to do it. So the cost-effective frontier actually help us to find the best treatments for the given budgets, but it does not indicate how much we should spend to obtain more life years or more quality of life. So to answer the questions, how much is one quality year worth? Well, we have to use different methods to do it. Well, one of them, it's basically to look at the labor market choice. Well, another way to do it is to look at the product purchase decisions of the populations. And the third is to look at the government policy. So estimating value of life, we can use the choice of labor decisions. So you might actually think that life cannot be valued economically, and most people think that life has an infinite value. However, there might be some situations that you might actually agree upon that illustrates the value of life can be different from person to person, and we can actually quantify it. So let's suppose there's a BC street with $1 million in it. So there's a suitcase in the middle of the street, and someone told you, well, you can actually get it. You can just walk out there to grab that suitcase, and then you will have $1 million. So if you cross this busy streets to get the suitcase, obviously there is 1% or maybe certain amounts of percents that you will be struck by a bus or maybe get killed. Are you going to risk your life for this $1 million? Well, of course, to you, maybe you will always say, no, I will never spend my life or take this 1% of chance to kill myself for that $1 million. However, you might actually want to think about, well, some people ultimately will actually go out there to grab that suitcase. So your life cannot worth more than $100 million to you if you choose to go out there to pick up the money. So obviously, there are so many ways that we can illustrate people's choice that indicates the values of life are can be quantified by money. But this one classic example illustrates ultimately there will be someone's think that it's worth to take the chance of 1% get killed to get that $1 million of suitcase. Well, in this particular case, if that chance it's really 1%, well, as long as you valued the $100 million worth for your life at that point, well, you will actually go out there to take that chance. So one way to measure the values of life is by looking at the labor markets and to actually study the decisions choice of workers in the market. So hypothetically, we know all the jobs involved with different risks for getting injury or maybe getting very bad consequences on health. Some jobs has higher opportunity, some jobs may not, such as people working in the office, preparing paperwork or doing calculations. Well, those are the jobs usually has a lower opportunity to involve with a fatal injury. On the other hand, other jobs such as running as an employee in a nuclear plant, or maybe as a firefighter, or maybe as a police, well, those are the jobs that will involve a little bit higher chance for getting involved with the fatal injury. So sometimes employer may actually pay a higher wages to attract people to work in those positions which involve with a higher risk of injury. So those extra wage, basically it's known as the risk premium. So this premium basically is the set like a compensations for the employer to compensate the employee for taking those risky jobs in the positions. Some researchers they are actually trying to figure out both the risk premium and the difference in risk of different job or positions so that they can actually estimate how much the worker value their life. So for example, a worker would be just willing to take a job with 1% higher fatal injuries risk for 50,000 more in wages versus a VSL of $50,000 divided by 0.01, which is 1%, equal $5 million. So in this case, people who value their life more than $5 million, well, they will not taking on this 50,000 additional pay in the job. Instead, they will actually find something that pay them a lower salary but risk-free in the job environment. On the other hand, people who value their life less than $5 million, well, those are the people who will be taking on this high salary jobs but high risk involved. Most of the study in the US labor market actually using this approach to estimate the value of life between $5 to $12 million in particular positions. However, the approach of using labor markets has some flaws to it. So some of those shortcoming of the labor markets approach is that, number one, it cannot tell whether people taking on the job because they really want to, or they have this specific skill that they can only work under those jobs, or maybe their objective for the job it's not to determined by the risk, such as firefighter. People work as a firefighter, maybe they just want to help the public. They want to actually help people instead of considering how dangerous it is. Sometimes those objectives may actually counter those risk factors in the jobs. And another problem with the labor market approach is that the competitive markets set wages based on the preference of the marginal worker instead of the average workers. So when the job market changes, well, it also changes the wages. When people actually getting more and more involved in the perfect competitive labor markets, well, of course, the marginal workers will earn less and less. So sometimes wages does not actually spit out the truth of the risks in those positions in the market. Another concern is that the difficulties for defining and measuring risks in the job. So sometimes we can actually define, let's say firefighter might actually get involved with the non-fatal accidents, but working in the nuclear plant, sometimes it could be very fatal because anything happens in the plant, either explosions or maybe exposures of the radioactive elements, it could cause cancer for those workers working in the plants. But how likely it happens and also how serious the condition can get involved become very difficult to measure. And lastly, those studies actually assume workers understand the risks associated with the daily jobs. So in this case, well, I would say not everyone truly understand the full possibility of risks that involve with the jobs. So in general, we actually think that the labor market approach may not actually accurately measuring the values of lives that we need. So we look at another way to do it, basically by looking at the purchase decisions of the consumers in the market. So in this approach, basically we are trying to use the price data in the markets to study whether people want to avoid certain types of risks in life by making a purchase on certain items. Well, example is basically by one of the example it's by Jenkins and al. In 2001. They are basically studying how likely people will purchase the children's bike hammers and also with the price of the products in order to estimate the values of life. So the decisions to wear helmets actually indicates judgment that the risk reductions of head tremors from bike accident is worth the cost of buying the helmets. I believe most of us actually agree by avoiding getting injury to the heads. Buying hammers for, let's say, $60 or even $100, it's totally worth the cost for buying it. So researchers using the price of the hammers to actually estimate the lower bounds for the values of risk reductions and using that piece of information to calculate the lower bound for the value of life of helmet wearers. This is a very simple approach, but then again, the measurements or the estimations of this approach also has its shortage. First of all, if we actually look into this specific example by Jenkins et al. 2001, the decisions for buying a hammer, it's not actually directly decided by the children's or the kids themselves. It's actually reflecting the parents' variations of their uh, uh, lives of their kids. So this purchasing decisions, it's not protecting the parents, which is the buyer in the market, but instead is someone that's under the provisions. So in this case, the estimations may actually over or maybe under the actually true estimations of value of life. So the evidence, it's proven that the indications that parents are especially risk averse about their young children's um, comparing to themselves. So in this case, well, this estimation might be actually overestimating the value of life by looking at a specific group of consumers in the markets. There are other purchasing decisions also being studied, such as the smoke detector, the safe cars, and unsafe cars. So those are the things that we usually measure, even though again it's not a very accurate estimation because there are so many controversial factors that could come into the models. But still, a lot of the policymakers still make use of these estimations to make decisions for the policy. So lastly, the final way to reveal the values of life depends on the regulations or maybe the government policies. So the government, they usually come up with the regulations or maybe making a decisions on certain regulatory policies based upon the judgment on whether the values of reducing the mortality rates in the markets outweighs the cost that they have to pay. So different regulatory agencies, they use a range of values of life, VSLs, to study different regulatory policies. So for example, the US FDA actually valued each statistical life at 2.7 million when they are trying to evaluate the policy that criminalized the sales of tobacco to children in 1996. So that means, well, the FDA actually valued a life um, worth about $2.7 million in the year of 1996 in order to make the judgment whether it makes sense to pass the regulations to criminalize those people who sell tobacco to children. It's not always the the governments can make the best decisions based on the estimations. Sometimes there are some political backlash. So for example, the US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, actually lowered the values of life for people above the age of 65 in the year of 2003. And that decision actually has a serious political backlash because it makes certain demographic groups in the country a little less valued comparing to a younger populations. So in this case, basically it goes back to the moral controversial questions. Well, is it true that the older people has a lower values of life comparing to a younger people? Well, in general, of course, we know that people who are older or maybe stepping into the retirement age, those are the people usually don't have much of productivities in the society. However, it's very difficult to actually make those statements in the society because, well, it's not fair for those people who have been working their life in the country and contribute so much in the life and not being valued the life equally as the younger populations. So that actually leads to the EPA to repeal the decisions and revert to treat the younger and older people equally. So the government's estimations somehow can be a index, or maybe it could be a benchmark how we actually look at the values of life and make certain decisions on those policies. But sometimes it might not be as accurate as it is. So the vast VSL literature actually aids the task of cost effectiveness analysis by providing those guidance on how much people value life and how much they would pay to decrease the risk of dying. So these estimates can be used to contract estimates for how much people value gains in health and then how much people value the quality of life. So for example, it's feasible to calculate the average values of the quality of life per year for a group of people with the average life expectancy for 40 years. And the VSL, in this case, it's $4 million. So we would need to apply the time decisions or the time discounting factor and estimate the quality weights of those 40 years, of course. But doing such calculation would allow us to determine not only the willingness to pay per quality of life, but also what's the optimal treatments could be. Because we can go back to the equations and formulas that we studied in the past and put in those numbers to actually see where the indifference curve actually tangents to the cost-effective frontier. So come to the conclusion to this chapter. So the insurers in general, they can either cover every single new technology and not refuse to cover all new procedures. And instead, most insurers, they are selective about which procedure to cover. So just like how we talk about, well, the insurers, either the public or privates, they are not stupid. They will not just tell the customers or telling their clients that they will always cover anything they choose. So the health technology assessments becomes a very, very important tool, and it has been used by many, many insurers and national health system in order to make use to actually come up with more cost-effective or the most cost-effective coverage decisions. So in the policy lecture ahead, we will hear more about the HTA, of course. By using those techniques or applying the techniques that we learned in this chapter, we are able to actually evaluate whether a healthcare system is more efficient than the other, or maybe there are certain benefits and costs that involve with different way to run the healthcare system in a country. So we are going to end the lectures on the supply side of healthcare system and moving on to the national levels of the healthcare system in the upcoming chapters. So the final, it's going to cover from the first chapter in the semester until this one. After this chapter, we are going to mainly apply what we learned in the previous chapters and including this one on the discussions of healthcare system in different countries. So make sure you read the chapters, make sure you read the textbooks and do the assignments. Prepare yourself for the final exams in the coming weeks. And then we are going to move on with the new source of materials after taking the final exams. So I'll see you next time.